You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Good. I'm excited to talk about a couple things today, right? For our banter session, anyway. So, I saw an announcement from Apple. They've chosen 6 states to collaborate with to expand the functionality of the wallet app on the iPhone. So, you can put your driver's license in to essentially use your phone to do the entire check in with TSA. Now, is this life changing? No, probably not, but I think we can all see where it's going.
Yeah, for sure. And for those listening, right, I think we're a couple weeks out from when this would publish. Arizona and surprisingly Georgia, I guess, at least in my mind, are the two first states that are going to allow this. You know, I think it's great. I think there will obviously be concerns around digital identity and the security of it. I already board my plane with a mobile boarding pass. I already pay my tolls through iPass here in Chicago, so I welcome it. One less thing I have to carry in my wallet, which at this point I don't really need a wallet for anything if I have a phone that has these kind of things in it. But what I also think this ends up being though is, are you familiar with the blue text and the green text debate around
No.
Android and iOS? So okay, so no. So, I think it's a little bit of a cachet sometimes where, it's like, oh, this is a green texter because people are looking down on people with Android phones versus the blue text with iPhone and iMessage. And it doesn't sound like there is a answer for this on the Android side yet. At least that has been announced. So I think this is another, a case of the haves and the haves nots, where if you have an iPhone, you could maybe do this. If you don't have an iPhone, you know, this is probably not there for you yet. At least again, it hasn't been announced. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm definitely familiar with that debate, and I thought of the same thing, right? I mean, it's ultimately got to be based on standards. It sounds like it is based on an ISO standard that Apple was involved with developing. And, Apple's usually an early mover. But I got to come back to something you said there, Jeff. I mean, us simple folk in Georgia, yes, we are one of the trailblazers in this area. And by the way, we've had running water now for several weeks, right? We have
Lies,
running
fake
water,
news.
electricity. Okay. I wanted to catch you up to speed on that.
Well, I'm surprised that, like, I would have expected something like California, right, to be kind of leading that charge, but I guess not in this case.
Right, right. Well, the other thing that I'm excited about is our guest this week, Gil, is from Boise, Idaho. Or I should say, he lives in Boise, Idaho. I don't think he grew up there. Uh, he might be our first guest who we can say that about. And, when I think of Idaho, I think of Boise State and that blue football field. I don't think anyone else has a blue football field. Um, but the one thing I think about when somebody really loves an area that they live in is that they say, "Oh, you wouldn't like it. Don't move here," right? Because that's what keeps a place great sometimes is not a lot of people thinking it's going to be great and moving there and then it getting overcrowded and driving up costs and all that. So it'll be interesting to see what Gil has to say about that.
Well, I think if that's the case, then humankind should just put a sign outside that just says, "Hey, you know what? Earth sucks. Don't move here," and that'll just probably stop all the alien invasions that are coming at some point in the future. So maybe we can just follow that line of thinking.
This sounds good.
All right. Well, you mentioned Gil. Why don't we go ahead and get into kind of what we're going to talk about today? And for a main topic, we've kind of structured a conversation that we're going to have around Microsoft hybrid identity. What it is and what it isn't, maybe, and also some things to think about that. So to help us with that is Gil Kirkpatrick. He's the chief architect at Semperis, and he's also a 17-year Microsoft MVP for both Active Directory and Enterprise Mobility. Welcome to the show, Gil.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Jim. How's it going today?
It's going great. And, we're always curious when we have someone on the show, especially for the first time, to understand kind of the origin story of how did you get into the identity space? Or as one of my brothers actually mentioned recently when we were talking is, when did you realize you were actually in the identity space? Can you kind of take us through kind of your journey to, how you started or realized it, and then where'd you end up today?
Yeah, that's actually a great way to think about it too, because it was definitely a case of realizing I was in the identity space. So I've been building commercial software products since the '70s. So I've been in the industry for a long, long time. And in the mid '90s, the small two guys in a garage startup company I was at started building products for Banyan networks. Banyan was probably the first real enterprise network to become publicly available, commercially available. And the reason it was so successful at the time was because it had an integrated directory and integrated authentication, globally distributed identity. That was a unique concept in the '90s. Um, they eventually sort of went by the wayside. They were overtaken by Novell with NDS/eDirectory, who did a much better job of it, I think. Yeah, at least in a lot of ways, it was a lot better job. And the company I was at started building products to manage the configuration, monitor the health of eDirectory, and we were really successful with that. We were probably the largest ISV focused on that platform at the time. And in the mid '90s, so this would have been '95, '96, we heard that Microsoft was looking to build a distributed enterprise directory as well to compete with Novell. At the time, for people who weren't in the industry at that point, Microsoft was pretty much a non-entity in the enterprise computing space. They were well known for the desktop, and there would be workgroup servers and maybe email servers or something like that. But Novell really owned the enterprise network. And so we got involved with the development team at Microsoft and the program management team at Microsoft for AD. And when they shipped Windows 2000, so it was originally NT5 and NTDS, turned into Windows 2000 and Active Directory, we shipped a product for monitoring the health of Active Directory pretty much at the same time. And I would say somewhere it would have been in the early 2000s is when I realized I was in the identity business, because I think that's when the concept of identity as a platform technology actually started to become popular.
Yeah, I think that's about around the time when I was into it too. It was like early 2000s. It was kind of like part of infosec sometimes, or maybe like help desk, and it's just kind of like, oh yeah, we're also doing these things like building Lotus Notes IDs and mainframe accounts at the same time we're doing like a bunch of other stuff. And I think you've done some work also. You might have mentioned it around identity defined security alliance. I know we've had Julie Smith on the show a few times and a few other folks from the IDSA. I think you're working with some NIST things. Is that right?
Yeah, so IDSA is focused on providing education and guidance around the combination of identity and security, which really is fairly new to people. The idea that identity is core to security. Um, you might even say it's like at the center of. Um,
Bingo.
you might say that, uh, and we actually got connected up with IDSA through our marketing VPs. So Tom Leduc found them doing some research in the just sort of general Google research in the industry, and they were squarely in the space that we were in um, at Semperis, trying to manage the integration of security and identity. So IDSA is focused on providing education and guidance in that area, and I'm currently the lead on a team that is developing the mappings of the IDSA security outcomes, which are all identity related, uh, to the corresponding existing standards that security practitioners might be more familiar with, like the NIST CSF, and there's probably half a dozen other NIST standards that we align with to a greater or lesser degree. We finished that up and just published it, I think, last week or maybe the week before. So it's on the idsalliance.org website. You can check that out. And our team is now going to focus on the CIS standards and draw the correspondence between what we're doing at IDSA with those standards as well.
Gotcha. And I think one of the other things too that I think that you're involved with is conferences specifically. I think one called the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference, which people can find at a very cool URL, by the way, hipconf.com. So congratulations on that URL pickup. Jim and I are big fans of kind of identity conferences, and we're at least I'm more familiar with like Identiverse, and obviously the other ones that kind of go along with that, like RSA, et cetera. I can't say I've ever been to HipConf. What can you tell us about that, and who is it for? And maybe a 30-second elevator pitch on why should people be looking at it?
Sure. So HipConf is focused on practitioners, so guys who actually have their hands dirty with Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, Okta, any kind of hybrid identity platform, and we'll talk about hybrid identity later, who are interested in securely managing it, tips and tricks, how does it work internally, what things do you have to watch out for, what's on the roadmaps, because we have a good relationship with the vendors. So but it's completely vendor agnostic. So it's just something that it's an educational conference for the identity and security communities. And in a lot of ways, it's an outgrowth of a conference that I did when I was at NetPro called the Directory Experts Conference, which the original approach for the Directory Experts Conference was, hey, I know a bunch of smart guys who know Active Directory. It'd be really cool to meet up at a Motel 6 with a case of beer and some pizza and just shoot the crap for a while. And that sort of morphed into an actual conference where people would travel to it and pay money and all of that. So we've been doing HipConf now for I think it's hard to say now, 4 years maybe, because of this last couple of years has been a little weird. And we do a global event we had been doing a global event in New York. We get a few hundred people to that. And then we've been doing regional events at major cities around the country. It's just a one-day thing, get a bunch of nice speakers in. And they've been really successful based on the feedback I've been getting from people there. So this year, the global event's going to be virtual again, and that's coming up in November. And like I said, you can get all the details on hipconf.com. Is it com? I think it is. Yeah. Not .org. Yeah.
Not .io or something.
Yeah.
But I will say, Gil, I mean, I'm with you, man. The conversations that you have in the hallway and at the hotel bar, those are what make the conferences, right?
Totally. I mean, it's literally half the value of going to a conference is those conversations rather than just what's in the sessions.
Yeah.
No question.
I mean,
No
I
question.
think we're all happy that we're able to at least have virtual conferences with the pandemic, but I'm sure looking forward to getting back on the conference circuit in person and seeing people and having those conversations over beer, over breakfast, or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's just something that crossed my mind as you're going through your origin story and talking about NT4 and then the first version of Active Directory being NT5. My origin story, I was at NT4 MCSE. It was Active Directory or Windows 2000 MCSE. But I always found it interesting that they baked obsolescence into the name. NT stands for new technology, right? And so this is 90s technology. And, I often joke, it's like, okay, this is new technology. What's the next version going to be? Newer technology, and then newest technology, and then ultimately you've got to change the name.
Yeah. Maybe it should just be like instead of NT, it should be TT. Today's technology.
Yeah, version whatever X.
Yeah. Well, Microsoft has a long and illustrious history of coming up with really stupid names for their products, and if we have time, we can talk about the 9 different names that their meta directory product, which I think is it called Microsoft Identity Manager now? I think that's its
It
sixth
used to be
name.
MIM, right?
Yeah, MIM, FIM, ILM, ILM2, it was an acquisition from a company called Zoomit, and I forget what its name was then, but it's oh god, there was one incredibly ridiculous name they had for 2 years that was I don't know. It's just been a horror story from a product naming standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the topics we brought you on to talk about today was hybrid identity or securing hybrid identity. Maybe what we could do is just ask you to start with kind of what is hybrid identity, and then our listeners are the IAM practitioners of the world. What do they need to know about securing hybrid identity?
So hybrid identity. Now let me back up a little bit. The most all organizations will have an on-prem identity system of some sort. Usually, it's focused around Active Directory. Sometimes it might be a literal identity and access management system that is closely tied to Active Directory. It synchronizes with it in some way, does provisioning into Active Directory, manages groups, that sort of thing. And that whole that combination of products and technologies is the on-prem identity system. Now you introduce a cloud platform like Azure is what we tend to focus on, but Amazon has the same sort of thing. Uh, that has its own identity system. And in order to minimize the amount of effort to actually adopt that, all of the vendors have provided for some sort of connection between whatever identity systems you have on prem with their identity system in the cloud. And as soon as you make that connection, you now don't have two separate identity systems. It's really a combined system, and you have to think about it that way. And that's the hybrid identity system. So if you consider the your IAM platform, whatever it might be, combined with Active Directory and all of the cloud applications that have their own directories and ability to do authentication and authorization and that sort of thing, that whole thing is your hybrid identity system. And it's helpful to think about it as a single thing rather than a bunch of disconnected things.
Yeah, that's interesting because we've had a few guests on the show within the past few months talk about this KEEM space, which is cloud entitlement identity management. It's kind of like a tool set for managing identity and access entitlements across multiple cloud environments, which is a challenge unto itself. I think the best practice that you're talking about, or kind of your perspective on the world, is really to try to look at it as one ecosystem, right? Do you look at it that way from a tooling perspective, or I guess kind of some recommendations from your perspective on, for the IAM practitioners of the world who are almost everybody's having some mix of on-prem and cloud world together now, or cloud infrastructure that they need to manage identity for. What are some of the recommendations that you have, and what are some of the best practices and perspectives that you can share?
So, probably the most important thing is well, first off, understand that you have an integrated system, and that has, and understand what the implications are for your security posture. Because as soon as you connect up your on-prem AD with, say, Azure AD, the any vulnerabilities or poor operating practices that you have for your on-prem environment don't just sort of magically go away, right? It's not like Azure AD is all new and Microsoft's running it for me and it's secure and I'm all done. What you've in a sense, what you've really done is you've taken all the you know poor operating practices and poor security and lack of patching and everything else from your on-prem AD and injected it into your Azure AD tenant. Um, so it's in a lot of ways, Azure AD is more secure than your on-prem AD, but as soon as you connect the two, it's a weakest link kind of story. So I think recommendation one is need to understand that just because you're using Azure AD does not make you more secure. You're only as secure as the weakest link, and it's usually your on-prem AD that's the weakest link. Probably the next thing is do the basics really well. Uh, configuring, and managing Active Directory securely is not a mystery anymore. That's over the last 20 years. We understand how to do that. We understand what the right kinds of group policies to apply are. We understand how to manage groups. We understand least privilege and role-based access control and how you manage that in an Active Directory environment. Um, we understand about passwords and why they're good and why they're bad and how to manage those. We know about two-factor. Most of the compromises that occur today are because people still don't do the basics right. People still don't patch their systems. I mean, this is how it seems like it's been 100 years, right? But it, if you do the basics, there's probably a list of like 10 basic things to do. If you do those, that gets you really, really far as making sure your on-prem Active Directory is safe, and the by virtue of that connection, it also keeps your Azure AD from being compromised as well.
Yeah, I think we even saw right recently with I think it was SolarWinds, where the government actually got a court order allowing them to hack into companies to fix some of their stuff. Maybe that was the Exchange vulnerability. I don't know. It seems like there's so many vulnerabilities out there, but patching is certainly critical of importance from a making sure that at least you're keeping up with the technologies that are out there. You mentioned Azure AD, and I think people hear it all the time. Before we get too far down in it, what is Azure AD? How do you explain it to folks that maybe aren't as Microsoft centric or maybe not as specific on the Azure side? Is it literally just Active Directory running in the cloud? Is it a bunch of domain controllers that are out there that Microsoft runs, and that's pretty much it? I guess, help us, level set kind of what people should be thinking about when they hear the term Azure AD.
So Azure AD is Microsoft's cloud-hosted uh, software as a service identity platform. And as an identity platform, it provides directory services, authentication, authorization, the ability to define who can get access to what in the cloud. It has built-in federation services, so you can log into Azure AD and then get access to Salesforce or something like that without, federated SSO. Um, it has privileged identity management. It has auditing, the ability to apply different levels of security controls for different roles. So it's a fairly full-featured identity platform that is part of Azure, and tightly integrated with Office 365. It is entirely distinct from Active Directory as you know it on-prem. It has, other than there's some storage, some code that is shared to do data storage, and I'm not even sure if that's true anymore. There's essentially no relationship other than the names sound sort of the same. Another great product naming fiasco in my mind. I'm sure it's working out well for Microsoft, but it is such a source of confusion because there's literally no. They're completely distinct. So you look at on-prem AD, you access the directory through the LDAP protocol, you do LDAP authentication, you do Kerberos authentication or NTLM, um, and you have group policy, which can manage your desktops and that sort of thing. None of that exists in Azure AD, right? They have OData as a directory protocol. They have OpenID Connect and OAuth for authentication. They do SAML for federation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the technology stack is entirely different. The APIs are entirely different. The user interfaces are entirely different. And really, the only way they connected to each other are through two things. One is the ability to synchronize the directory data, users and groups and things like that from your on-prem environment into the cloud or back again, so into Azure AD. And the ability to uh, do federated single sign-on, so you can log into your Active Directory on-prem, and through the magic of SAML and ADFS, you can get access single sign-on to your Azure AD. But other than that, they're completely distinct technologies, and the skills that you have for managing AD on-prem completely do not apply to Azure AD. at least from sort of an operations standpoint. Now, that being said, it's an identity platform and it requires the same kind of management that any identity platform does. So the idea of assigning roles and privileges and figuring out who should have those are identity management tasks that you perform with your on-prem AD. You also have to perform them with Azure AD.
So it seems like it's very well designed, right, for the cloud and kind of the future. And one of the things that I constantly hear from the folks that I work with is, oh yeah, we definitely want to be in the cloud focus, et cetera. Is it realistic to be 100% in the cloud when it comes to your AD infrastructure if you still have on-prem applications, or is it a little bit, too much of a pie in the sky right now? There needs to be some maturation or migration away from maybe on-premise stuff to make that happen.
It depends a lot on the size of the organization and the amount and the size of their on-prem IT computing assets, right? It's entirely reasonable to move in that direction, and it's entirely reasonable for especially smaller orgs to be entirely in the cloud that way and have no on-prem infrastructure. So you don't have servers, you don't have on-prem AD, you just have everybody with a laptop. They log into Azure, they get access to Office 365. That's an entirely reasonable scenario. The larger the organization gets, the harder that story is because they have a lot of investments in their on-prem IT, and particularly if they've got line of business apps that either they developed internally or that they purchased and only run on Windows Server, it still makes sense to keep that kind of stuff on-prem or to run on a cloud, infrastructure as a service instance. So the idea of getting rid of your on-prem AD entirely becomes a tougher ask. That being said, I know some really, really large companies that are well on their way to moving to that kind of situation where they have no on-prem AD. And one of them, God, they have a couple 100,000 employees, and so it's huge infrastructure. They've been really leading edge as far as cloud deployment's concerned, and they just delayed their transition another 3 years. So they were supposed to be sort of off their on-prem AD, I think, end of this year. They've pushed that out again. So it's definitely a reasonable scenario for smaller orgs. It's a good target, I think, for medium to large orgs. But it's one of those things that's definitely a journey, not a destination. And longer term, I think one of the things that people don't talk about so much is the cost structure of moving to the cloud. So the cost models are obviously entirely different when you consume everything as software as a service, and you can't really amortize any of your on-prem investments anymore. And I'm certain that what we're going to find is that there's actually, for every organization, there's going to be sort of a sweet spot of how much do they run in the cloud and how much do they run on-prem, because it's actually cheaper for them to run it on-prem. And that will be the case. People are still pretty much, the vast majority of IT orgs are still very much focused on moving everything to the cloud. Once they start analyzing those bills a little more carefully, I think they'll understand that some of this stuff is actually makes sense to run on-prem. And whether Active, so if you look out 5-10 years in the future, whether Active Directory will be part of that, hard to say. But I think that's where we end up with a much more fluid computing model where some of your stuff is running on-prem, some of it's running in the cloud, and ideally you can shift it back and forth just to reflect the cost benefit ratio.
Yeah, I think it comes down to a lot of, like, capex, opex, right? People just haven't built into their budgets. The big spend up front is typically how it's been done in the past versus that subscription model, maybe. Um, Speaking of subscription models, when someone moves to the cloud, there's sometimes this expectation that they're buying a result versus maybe um, a technology or an application. And some of that I think maybe is around some of the things that the vendors put out there. It's like, oh, we have this uptime or we have this availability for resiliency. But when it comes to things like Azure, what is the responsibility of the customer? Are they responsible for managing the security of it, and it's just Microsoft does the availability? Is it kind of a shared responsibility? What's your view on that?
So it's certainly a shared responsibility. It's not like you move everything into Azure and throw up your hands and say, "Finally, we're secure and we don't have to worry about it anymore." The what changes when you migrate to the cloud is sort of where that boundary line is and how much of it can you worry about or have some effect on, and how much can you not. So in an on-prem deployment, you're responsible for the security of everything from the hardware and cabling through the firmware, through the OS, through the applications that are running on it. You own the whole thing and you have to manage the security of all of that yourself, all the way up through the identity stack. So, as far as provisioning users and managing access control and all. When you migrate to the cloud, the lowest levels of management, so as far as provisioning and managing servers and patching them and all of that, that's now Microsoft's problem. It's not to say that you can just say, well, that's their problem, it's not my problem. It's still your problem, but you've essentially delegated it to Microsoft, and you have to be comfortable with the practices that they employ to patch all their servers and manage the security, that which they do really, really well. I mean, way better than nearly any commercial organization ever could. But it's still something you have to consider when you adopt a cloud platform, is you have to understand how they actually manage that stuff and how that affects your own security posture. But everything above that layer, so everything above the, say, the APIs that they're exposing to you, is still your problem. So you need to manage passwords and multi-factor authentication. You need to establish the right kinds of policies to make sure that that stuff is kept secure. You need to provision and deprovision users. Deprovisioning users is still a problem. That I mean, we used to joke about there's a story going around in New York. I think this is back in the '80s, so this is back in the mini computer days, and when long distance telephone service was not sort of universally accessible. So it was a high cost thing. And we had deprovisioning problems then where employees would move to another company and they would take their long distance service with them because nobody ever looked at the 29 feet worth of phone bills every month. Um, and they had long distance service for life. There was a guy who actually he left a big financial company in New York to a competitor. He sold his house with the provision that it had free long distance service because his employer was still paying for it.
Someone forgot to
So
deprovision the calling
exactly.
card
So
there.
this deprovisioning thing has been a problem for 40 years, and it's still a problem. It's amazing, and you're still responsible for that, right? Microsoft can't do that kind of level of identity management for you, nor would you want them to. So you're still responsible for everything above the really the API layer, I would say.
What about configuration of services? Is it incumbent on a company like Microsoft or Amazon or whoever, right, is kind of providing these to provide hardened or secured pre-configured applications, applications or appliances? Or is it more of like, hey, here's Windows, it's not secure by default, here's our recommendations on what you should do, but they don't do it maybe out of the box because of policy or app compatibility or whatever it may be? Who does it fall on to really kind of tackle that? Because I think we see all the time, right? It's misconfigured S3 buckets or misconfiguration of server somewhere that leads to some breach or outage or whatever it may be. Who does that responsibility really lie with?
So at the end of the day, it's as a customer of a cloud vendor, it's still your responsibility, right? It's your data, it's your users. You have to take responsibility and ownership for it. The nice thing about SaaS software in general is that the number of dials and switches that they expose has been significantly reduced. So there's much less that you can be worried about. And in I think I would look at this and say, in some ways Microsoft has maybe done this a little bit better than Amazon, because when you're dealing with Amazon and EC2 and all the other Amazon uh, cloud services, they've they're infinitely configurable, right? I mean, they've got lots and lots of things that you can tune and tweak to make it work the way you want. And that means that there's a zillion different ways to do it wrong or do it insecurely. Um, and so to the degree that the cloud vendors can simplify the kinds of configuration they expose to their customers, I think that's generally to the good. End of the day, though, it's still on you to do this all securely. You have to understand what your security posture is, and your use of a cloud vendor is just part of that security posture. You need to understand what their security posture is.
Got me thinking of an analogy here. Let me try it. Might take us off topic a little bit, but it kind of feels like when you buy a car, it's got seatbelts and airbags and crumple zones and all that. You can still drive it off a cliff and kill yourself, and you would be responsible for that. You can't sue Ford and say, "Well, you gave me a car that wasn't,
That allowed me to
was
drive off a cliff.
allowed me to drive off a cliff." But what if you have a self-driving car
Mhm.
and it drives off a cliff? Well, then you have a different story. But it seems to me that the world we live in right now with cloud services is more you've got a car with seatbelts and airbags, and you have to still be smart enough not to drive it off a cliff.
I think that's a good analogy because you can also look at things like cloud hosted SaaS software as sort of the self driving feature, right? Today, you can't, Tesla, as an example, explicitly says you have to pay attention while you're driving, even with the self driving feature on. Now, we know people don't do that, and mostly they don't kill themselves, but sometimes they do. And uh, the driver's still responsible. Now, maybe some point in the future that it will be mature enough that everybody is quite comfortable saying that's no longer the driver's responsibility, but or in our case, that's no longer the company's IT's responsibility; it's the vendor's responsibility. But we're not there yet.
I will say, as a proud Tesla owner myself, and having recently taken a 400 plus mile road trip one way using autopilot, there is no way that anybody should be trusting the autopilot to be the answer for all their ills when they're driving. Not right now. It is not there. It is not ready. And all these knuckleheads that you see in the videos where they're sleeping or they're in the back seat, there are enough prompts, warnings, and things that Tesla does that will disable autopilot unless you actively keep it engaged. And there are ways to do it, right? It's a couple of ways to look at it is you turn the wheel and it's looking for torque on the wheel. So how do you get past that? Well, you weigh something heavier on one side of the wheel, and they make things that you can attach to the steering wheel to obviously bypass that. Now they've enabled the camera inside the cockpit to kind of look for driver awareness and things like that, which other cars have as well. It's not just a Tesla thing. So there are things out there, but people are finding ways to get around it. But I can tell you right now, I'm a huge fan of Tesla. I love mine, it's like the best thing I've ever bought, but it is not ready for prime time. And there are some real idiots out there who are just not thinking when it comes to letting the Tesla drive for them. It's not there yet.
Yeah, that would be analogous to signing up for your Azure tenant and giving everybody complete administrative access to your tenant and say, yeah, if you need access to something, just set it up for yourself, would you? Yeah, that won't be secure.
It wouldn't be an episode of Identity at the Center if Jeff didn't talk about his Tesla. It also wouldn't be an episode of Identity at the Center if Jim didn't bring up ransomware. So that is my next question. So, Gil, I know a lot of what you and Semperis have been focused on is disaster recovery, and we're not talking about um, your grandfather's disaster recovery, where an asteroid takes out your data center and oh no, how are you going to get everything back online over the weekend? What we're talking about today is, you know, one great example is ransomware, where they come in and own your Active Directory, get domain admin credentials, and start erasing things. Um, am I right there? Is that kind of where your focus is? And tell us about that.
So that's, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, this has changed the security landscape substantially. Um, and if you look at how these attacks transpire, almost all of them now go through Active Directory in some way or another. And it's not because Active Directory is quote insecure. It's sort of in the nature of a global or an enterprise scale single sign-on system that it has these kinds of characteristics that companies can that attackers can take advantage of. So at Semperis, we're focused on the security of the hybrid identity system. So that includes on-prem, starts with on-prem AD, goes to Azure AD, Okta, all the other identity systems that you might have. And we basically we have an approach similar to the NIST CSF, that we look at what do you do before an attack, what do you do during an attack, and what do you do after the attack. And in many cases, when attackers have managed to get into your Active Directory and say domain access, domain admin access, they can encrypt all your domain controllers. They can corrupt the AD in some way. They can give themselves backdoors. They can create new accounts for themselves. They can alter uh, group policy. They can distribute files to all of the workstations through sysfile replication. There are a lot of things in Active Directory that the attackers can take advantage once they've managed to get to domain admin. And so you mentioned disaster recovery in particular. The story is not for disaster recovery for Active Directory isn't any different than it was 15 years ago. It's just that people now have to worry about it. So Active Directory over the last 20 years has proven to be very robust and resilient in the face of those typical disasters like the asteroid taking out your data center, right? Every other part of Active Directory will continue to work just fine. But ransomware is different in that it's a systemic attack. So once they get in, they can then essentially corrupt all of your domain controllers more or less instantaneously. And recovering from that kind of from an attack, that kind of attack, is really really hard. And it's something that Microsoft never really addressed in the design of Active Directory. Is how do you recover the whole thing from backup? If you have a scorched earth kind of scenario, how do you get your Active Directory back from the one good backup that you have laying around? It's a hard process. And if you look at, say, an incident like the Maersk attack from 3 years ago, I guess now, it took them. First of all, it was pure luck they were able to recover their Active Directory, because there was one domain controller somewhere in Africa that had been powered off at the time of the attack, and they were able to recover the data from that disk drive. Um, but it took them more than a week to get their Active Directory up to the point where they could start bringing on all their applications again. And that's a week of downtime. And for most organizations, that if it's not fatal, it's certainly crippling to have that kind of downtime.
Yeah, we've worked with other organizations who ran into that same scenario that you just described for Maris, where they got lucky that they had a domain controller that happened to be offline that the hacker didn't get to.
Yep.
Um, because recovering from this attack, is, you mentioned going back to your one good backup. Well, how long have they been in there? They may have infiltrated your AD and created those backdoors months ago.
Yep.
How far do you have to go back in the AD? And even if you do go back that far, how do you close the gap from back that far to everything that you've done over the last 6 months?
It's a hard problem.
It's a hard problem.
It's a truly hard problem. And just the recovery from backup itself is hard enough. Our products have been really successful in speeding that up by several orders of magnitude, um, and making that whole process more reliable. I used to run a workshop it was part of our directory experts conference thing, that I'd bring people in, give them a set of 4 VMs running. They're all 4 domain controllers, 2 domains, and let them make a backup. And then I gave them about 20 pages of step-by-step instructions of how do you recover your AD from this backup. And it was a half-day process, so they had about 3.5, 4 hours, and about 20% were able to do it successfully. I mean, it's just a hard thing for people to do manually. So going back to your question there about how do you tell how far back in your backups do you have to go? It's really hard because sometimes attackers may be in there for months. They may have given themselves fresh accounts, added things to groups. If you have really good security practices, you might be able to catch that in audits and things like that. But really, what you need is a fairly detailed timeline of all the changes that went into your Active Directory over, when do you think your first compromise occurred, and you have to look at that and figure out where the compromise might have spread into your Active Directory. Like, when was the last update to domain admins? Who did it? What was added to it? Do we think that account was compromised? That sort of thing.
If it was easy, then there wouldn't be so many attacks, right?
Yes.
It wouldn't be so much of a prevalent problem, and I don't see it getting better anytime soon, at least.
Well, it's Microsoft is not investing in on-prem AD at all anymore. It's in fact in 2022, the Windows Server 2022, I think there was 0 changes to Active Directory. So that story is not improving for your on-prem environment.
Well, I think it's clear the direction is the cloud, right? And I think that is kind of where most
Yeah.
organizations would love to be in the cloud, but it's hard to move a freight train sometimes when you have, especially the larger organizations with a bunch of app dependencies, et cetera. You've been really generous with your time, and I want to be kind of cognizant of that as we kind of start to wrap things up here. But I would like to ask a totally an oddball question, I should say, actually a couple of them. I've noticed in the background here, as we've been talking here, that you are quite the rubber chicken collector. I need to understand why this is, and blink twice if you need help.
So, okay, so I'll try and make a brief timeline. But when I was at NetPro, when we were building our first products for Active Directory in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was asked to speak at an Air Force symposium in Montgomery, Alabama, Air Force IT symposium, and talking about Active Directory. And they also had a little vendor area. This is a kind of a small scale thing. And for some reason, I had this idea that would be really cool to have a giveaway at our little booth there. And I thought, rubber chickens. I have no idea where that came from, right? And I mentioned that to our marketing people, and they sort of said, well, yeah, whatever. And I said, yeah, order them from here. And one day, a couple of weeks before the conference, this giant, FedEx brings in a giant box. You open it up, and it's 200 rubber chickens. I mean, the classic vaudeville on the stage, beat the guy over the head with a squeaky rubber chicken kind of thing. And those things, we literally had a line of 30 people at our booth. Everybody had no idea what we did or cared. What they wanted was a rubber chicken. And it was just one of those weird things. So I kind of adopted the rubber chicken, and I used it at our conferences, the Directory Experts Conference, and I would use it to start the entire event. I'd get up on stage, and there's 500-600 people in the audience, and squeak the chicken into the microphone, and everybody goes quiet, right? So that's sort of the brief history, and now it's at the point where every couple of months or so, rubber chickens appear at my door, and I don't know who it is or who they might be, but some people have decided that they should send me rubber chickens periodically. So they just kind of appear in a box. They're from Milwaukee, or they're from China, or I have no idea. It's pretty weird.
I guess there's worse things you could be getting in the mail. Uh, I guess I would take it as a form of flattery, getting fan mail in the form of rubber chickens, but I can only imagine, customs or import officer or something like that opening the box and saying, "What the heck is Gil doing?"
So actually, so one of our speakers at this directory experts conference flew over from the Netherlands where he lives, and he brought a whole bunch of rubber chickens with him to give out to people in his sessions. And he, of course, got stopped, and he had to fill out the form about what was in there, and there wasn't enough space to really describe what it was. So it was a box of 60 rubbers. And yeah, it's endless fun. What can I say? I think the only problem is I just have this terrible fear that on my gravestone it won't say anything about improve the security posture of thousands of organizations or wrote great books and magazine articles or anything like that. It's going to just have a rubber chicken on it.
It'll be like, I think it's Jim Morrison's grave in France, which I've been to, where they leave gum outside there, some kind of weird thing like that. But I mean, it's unique. You'll be known as kind of that guy, I guess, for better or for worse. We're running out of time here, but before we go, I want to kind of pass it around the room real quick for any final thoughts or comments or words of wisdom, Gil, that you want to drop onto our listening audience when it comes to how should they be looking at modern approaches, I guess, really to kind of securing hybrid identity.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would say is hybrid identity and cloud-based identity are major steps up from what we can do on-prem with something like Active Directory. But the security problems are still largely the same. They don't just magically go away. Maybe there's a little less surface area you have to worry about, but all of the basics still apply. You still have to put your smart security guy hat on, and you have to do the work. No way around it.
Jim, how about yourself?
I got to go back to something that Gil said about giving away conference novelties. So I just had a funny story I've got to share. So one year when we were with Identropy, Jeff Chang decided, hey, we'll get these reusable solo cups with the Identropy logo on it, and we'll have like beer or alcohol, and we'll set up a little bar. And we get to the conference, and they're like, no, you can't give away alcohol here. So we had these solo cups, hundreds of them, and nobody wanted them. I mean, people were walking by, were like, hey, you want a solo cup? Nobody took them. So at the end of the conference, it was like, all right, do we throw these out? And I was like, well, no, I just can't do that. So I took them home, and I had hundreds of solo cups with Identropy's logo on it for years until I finally threw them out.
Oh no.
I still have two, actually, and they are a high quality plastic cup. Like, I mean, dishwasher safe. When you think solo cup, you think like these flimsy, thin plastic ones, but these are good. I still use them. They're a great water cup. Was it the best swag idea? No, definitely not. But rubber chicken is certainly, I would say, better than that for sure. And having good swag is key.
Yeah, it's weird. It's hard to know ahead of time what's actually going to click with people and what isn't. I certainly didn't expect that kind of reaction to rubber chickens, and I know there are people who went to our conferences 15 years ago and they still have their rubber chicken.
Well, I think it's important that vendors out there, especially when you're going to these conferences, really think about your swag, right? I mean, it seems like everybody does kind of the same thing and it goes in cycles. So a few years ago, it was probably like those multi USB cables that
Yep.
charge a whole bunch of devices and it just had your logo on it, right? Okay, well, everyone's doing that. Why do I need to go to your booth then, right? I remember a couple years ago at RSA, someone was giving away lightsabers. They were like these little plastic light up things, and people were lined up because maybe it wasn't for them, maybe it was for the kids, or maybe they're just saying it was for the kids and they don't really have them. Either way, it drew people to there. So I think, and it doesn't necessarily have to be expensive, but I think, my plea to vendors is, when I go to conferences, I want to see some cool looking swag, and you got a lot better chance of me getting over there and letting you scan my badge, if there's something in it for me, in exchange for that annoying email that I might get later on, 3 or 4 or 5 times asking if I'm still interested in their product or not. So
yeah, it's got to be different. It's amazing how quickly marketing organizations converge on one set of swag, and then somebody has to break out of that mold and come up with some other idea.
Yep, it's like the year of the USB, the year of the mints. I don't know who comes up with this stuff.
Or the bouncy balls that flashed, or the little badge
the
holders that had
yep.
Oh, fidgets! Holy cow!
Yeah. So, all right. I think that's a good spot. Maybe we can leave it for this week, since we've thoroughly disgusted Gil with the idea of a fidget spinner. That's always the goal here, is to thoroughly disgust our guests when we have them on the
Yep.
show. But definitely want to thank you, Gil, for your time and having this conversation with us. We're going to have a link to Gil's LinkedIn on our show notes, as well as a link to semperis.com, Semperis, and also a link to HipConf, the Hybrid Identity Conference, HIPCONF.com. So people can kind of check that out. And as always, you'll find links to Jim and I on LinkedIn there, and you can always connect with us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast, and on the web, our shiny, still kind of relatively newly rebranded website, identityatthecenter.com. And with all that marketing out of the way, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Thanks, Gil. Thanks, Jim. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.